Okay. Here.
What would you do?
Okay.
What do you say? You can say,
No, I shall do it. There are lots of slides. Lots of pictures.
all right, our next speaker is Lieke van Deinsen.
Thank you. Turn this on. How come you can? Yeah, is this fine? Okay, brilliant. So let's start right away before I run out of time. Collecting portraits of the learned was popular practice in the early modern republic. By the turn of the 18th century, it proved even such an essential part of the prevailing intellectual habitus, the German phonologist Sigmund Jakob Appin even decided to publish a treatise on how to optimally assemble such a portrait collection. Contrary to what its title, Instructions on How to Usefully Collect the Portraits of Famous and Learned Men, suggests, Appin adopts an inclusive viewpoint on who could become part of these intellectual group portraits in terms of gender diversity. Since all times, various women have manifested themselves who have practiced and excelled in theology, philosophy, and especially poetry, he states, it makes a collection even more impressive by including women. A rather progressive viewpoint, one might say, in a period women were still oftentimes regarded exceptions in the institutionalized intellectual debate. One of the contemporaries that took Appin's work by heart was the prominent historian of philosophy, Johann Jacob Brücker, the protagonist of my contribution today. Anticipating the growing demand for likeness of the learned, he co-initiated a project that would result in one of the most ambitious printed portrait galleries of the time. Between 1741 and 1755, Brücker, together with the Augsburg engraver and publisher Johann Jacob Haidt, published a portrait gallery presenting the famous learned of the day, the Bielenzaal, a portrait gallery of living writers famous for their learning. Carefully planned and executed in 10 installments, each containing 10 portraits of a wide variety of scholars from different national, religious, and academic backgrounds, published simultaneously in German and Latin, the project aimed to reach the widest possible audience in the Republic of Letters. Driven by their borderless ambition, the compilers also had a female public in mind, and from the very start, they decided also to include learned women. Because our times, too, are so lucky that here and there a woman gloriously presents herself on the stage of learning, Brücker states in the introduction to the first volume. A place in this collection is also reserved for them. The quote was here. Which contemporary women were selected to become part of this ambitious project, and why? And how did their individual likenesses function within this international group portrait? Were they treated as intellectual equals, or did they remain exceptions in the intellectual field? And did this internationally orientated project indeed contribute to the spread of their name, fame, and face throughout the Republic of Letters? Before addressing these questions, a very few words on the uses of portraits of the learned in the Republic of Letters, the rise of printed autoportraits and portrait collections, and the struggle of learned women to deal with this genre. Over the course of the early modern period, portraiture became an increasingly important medium in scholarly identity construction. Both authors' biographical details and their physical features became increasingly important as the idea gained ground that intellectual inspiration was not drawn from external sources but from the individual's own inner and evocative power. Consequently, portraits of the learned started to widely circulate in the Republic of Letters, being included in letters displayed in libraries and study rooms. Viewing the faces of contemporary like-minded as well as learned predecessors from all corners of the internationally orientated learned community was assumed to act and spark one's own mind. The increased prominence of portraits of the learned was also reflected in early modern book production. Especially from the 17th century onwards, printed autoportraits were not only included in books sold separately, collected and displayed, but it became an essential part of the branding of intellectual authority. Their popularity also gave a boost to the publication of printed portrait collections of the learned and literate. As visual genealogies able to cross dimensions of both time and space, portrait collections not only provided the abstract notion of the Republic of Letters, Esther talked about, with actual faces, in presenting it as a collective image or images, and defining it through examples, they also contributed to making it. As such, they functioned as the organic link of the learned world. They enhanced the public visibility of an intellectual community through recurring and aesthetic elements and collective display. Especially this public visibility proved a challenge for the growing group of learned women active in the Republic of Letters. The increased autonomy of the individual in the early modern period notwithstanding, the opportunities of women, as we all know, participating in the public domain remained limited. If speaking and writing publicly was already considered challenging to the prescriptive definition of modest female behavior, printing a picture of one's person for purchase in print distribution among a wide audience was all the more scandalous. When a portrait of a learned woman was printed, even when it was constructed with the utmost care, it could easily meet with public disapproval, resulting in mutilations, such as this portrait of Margaret Kennedy. Just give you only one example of the sources I'm working with, or hard remarks, such as in this case of Anna Maria van Schuurman. Most portraits of the early modern learned women then were published and subsequently, albeit sporadically, included in printed portrait collections only after their death. Their likenesses predominantly serving a memorial function. It was only by the 18th century, as I've argued elsewhere, learned women's assertive attitude towards printing their portraits changed generally, and the number of circulating portraits of living female authors quickly increased. By the time Brugge and Haidt conceived their printed portrait gallery in the 1740s, the moment seemed right to, perhaps for the first time, could count on the active cooperation of women writers. Indeed, eventually, 4 women, contemporary learned women, the German poetess Louise Gottsched, the French mathematician Émilie du Châtelain, the Italian physicist Laura Bassi, and the German poetess Magdalena Rieger agreed to collaborate on their inclusion in the Bildungssaal. Their assistance was of the essence, since the initiators had set the unprecedented goal to provide the Republic of Letters with the most authentic portraits of its key members. And to fulfill this high promise, Brugge, sometimes calling in the assistance of his extensive network, reached out to the authors every step of the process, asking them to send a resembling portrait Haidt could use as a model, to provide detailed and additional information for their complementary written biographies, and eventually also to comment upon the first proofs. Because of this thorough approach, in several cases, correspondence survived revealing the background stories on how these portraits were realized and in some cases received by the learned community. Regarding the women included, such information is, at least as I found now, available for 2 women included in the project, Louise Gottsched and Émilie de Châtelet. Brugge himself maintained a long and intensive correspondence with the famous Gottsched couple. In numerous letters to both the husband, the distinguished writer Johann Christoph, who himself was also included in the Bildungssaal in a later installment than his wife, he corresponded extensively on their inclusion in the collection. It invites for a close comparison between the possible gender differences between the couple, but I'm not going to talk about that today. In the case of du Châtelain, the Swiss mathematician Johann Bernoulli acted as the intermediary. These correspondents, each in their own way, provide us with unique insights on how these women themselves thought about their visual public image. Therefore, in the remainder of my very short contribution today, I decided not to talk in detail about the equally fascinating biographical sketches of these women included in the publication, and address the many questions they raise about inclusion and intellectual equality, but that is something Ruud Hagenbruber has recently brought forward as well. But to focus on what their letters reveal about the way 18th century women how they related to their public image on the one hand, and shed light on the circulation and uses of these portraits on the other. At first, both Gottsched and du Châtelet proved undividedly enthusiastic about the request to become part of this intellectual group portrait. After receiving a flattering invitation, Gottsched rushed to have her portrait painted and sent to Hyde, and du Châtelet as well proved eager to accept the request without a second thought. "I'm flattered," she replies, "by the company in which they want to put me, and that they have thought of me, including in the collection you spoke of." And she promises to send a copy of a recent portrait by the famous artist Jean-Marc Nattier, who's the very best, painted of her with a coach from Strasbourg. But despite her initial enthusiasm, both women were eventually very disappointed when the proofs arrived. Hyde's attempt to construct a collective image of the Republic of Leather, presenting each of the authors in a very similar fashion, that is, in three quarters in front of a stone portal adorned with a family weapon and credential in the midst of their study room, did not turn out very well in Gottsched's case. Translating the provided example Louise had sent him, depicting the poetess from the waist up into the Wildenzaal model, which was a bit longer, something went wrong. Although Bruckner has explicitly promised the changes would not impact the authenticity of the likeness, upon viewing the proofs, Louise did not recognize herself. She was confronted with a woman, and I quote, "too large and too stiff," presented against the background of what she interpreted as 4 shelves of folio-sized books, only enhancing the extraordinary physiognomy of the person depicted. Having not seen her in real life, Hyde transformed the very petite woman into a small giant. Running out of time, Hyde's only feasible solution was to add a very, very short arm to indicate that the person was not big at all. The final portrait then again failed to impress the Gottscheds. He made some adjustments on it. And when sometimes later another portrait of Louise was published, they did not miss the opportunity to send a copy to Bruckner to confront him. It could have been done differently. Du Châtelet proved not impressed at all, again, to say the least. Due to logistical issues, she was not able to send over the preferred Nattier portrait, but was forced to provide a copy less to her liking. When du Châtelet received the proofs in the winter of 1745, she seemed not surprised that printed portrait of Hyde had fabricated not to her likeness. In the response, she makes no bones about it. "I received, sir, the 6 portraits that you announced to me. I admit they are frightening, but it is less the fault of the engraver than the painter." In contrast to the Gottscheds, du Châtelet seemed to be able to see some humor in it. "My self-esteem is still at stake, because those who will see me in real life will find me laughed at, since one always assumes that portraits are embellished." For du Châtelet, who seems to have been painted many, many times before, the prestige of being counted among the most important learned of the day, as well as having the most flattering biography, partly written by Voltaire, highlighted her intellectual accomplishments, proved more important than a portrait that would only become one of many. "I'm looking forward to the moment it's published," she concludes. Despite their modest number and sometimes poor execution, the portraits of learned women included in the series particularly caught the eye of the public. In October 1742, a euphoric editor could update the Gottsched couple on the success of the series' first installment. Even their ambition to market an international audience turned out feasible, especially in Italy. The volume was very well received, I quote. To Bucca's delight, particularly the German poetess provoked responses. In their detailed review, a Firenze scholarly journal, for example, had highlighted Gottsched's likeness to emphasize the important contribution contemporary learned women in the Republic of Letters could make in general. The wish Bruckner once expressed in a letter to the Gottsched that Louise's portrait, and I quote, would find its way to every study room, in the Republic of Letters also proved and provide contemporaries with inspiration also became true. Judging by the frequent references to the portrait in the correspondence, Many of the approximately 800 to 1,000 prints Heide provided fell in the eager hands of the learned. The portrait was even worthy an alternative for meeting Gottschalk in person. When the royal counselor in Dresden, Johann Christian Benemann, lamented in a letter to the Gottschalk about missing the opportunity to meet her in person, he found comfort in the alternative of her forthcoming portrait. I'm looking forward to seeing her soon in the cover. Yet, despite these lyrical reactions, Bruckner could not prevent the portrait of learned women in the Dealsaal also provoked similar suggestive responses as their predecessors experienced for centuries. I will limit myself, with pain in my heart, to only one example. In a fan letter, the Swiss historian Johann Georg Altmann wrote to Louise, he states, I'm not insensitive by nature, but allow this widower the pleasure of displaying your picture, as engraved by Mr. Hyde, in my room in such a way that it catches the eye of all who is visiting me, so that I'm always giving the pleasant opportunity to praise your merit. And it goes on a bit more sexual in the following. Let me come to a very provisional conclusion. One could argue that by their inclusion in the Bildungssaal, Bruckner and Hyde's project marked a new emancipatory stage in the acceptance of learned women as part of the internationally oriented learned community. But as part of this group project, their images were spread across Europe and reached a wide audience. As such, the case of the Bildungssaal illustrates how, by the 1740s, learned women could cross boundaries of traditional genres, the portrait gallery of contemporary learned, as well as geographical borders. However, despite their growing prominence and acceptance as part of the learned community, as their inclusion in the Bildungssaal has materialized, learned women still remain exceptions to a rule. Contrary to what Apin in his manual, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, advised, Bruckner and Hyde, for example, did not decide to present the selected women in alphabetical order between their male colleagues. We reserved a special spot for them near the end of every installment, underlining that there were categories of their own. In addition, despite Hyde's efforts to uniform all portraits, producing costly new prints of each selected author, the images of learned women remain subject to critique on their physical appearance, both by themselves as well as by contemporaries. Being able to indisputably embody intellectual agency still seems a bridge too far. But that's something I want to discuss later on more. Thank you.